Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 390 of the Running Rogue podcast. This is your host, Chris McClung, coming to you on video and audio with co host James Dodds. James, how are you today?
Doing well. Got another sunshiny day in Austin, which is nice.
Not quite as bluebird as the other day, but a good one nonetheless. We're excited to be talking today about running by feel as we head into chapter 6 of the book, the last chapter of kind of the first section of the book, where we lay down a lot of the foundational elements. And so we're going to be talking about running by feel. We've talked about it a little bit, kind of teased it a little bit. We've also talked about some of the elements in this chapter already, some of the science behind the different effort zones and why those are important and how they all fit together. Spent a lot of time on that last week. Today, we're going to pivot slightly from the emphasis of the book in this chapter, which is a mix of the science and the practical application of running by feel, and just focus more on the practical side of it, as I think that's going to be more interesting and useful for the audience in this near term. You'll have to pick up the book to get the science part.
Mm-hmm.
We'll cover some of those elements today, but really want to get into the practical sides of running by feel and how you do that, which is much easier said than done. I will also remind people of the quote argument, quote unquote, that we had about what is the hardest of these things for people to master in terms of the fundamental training principles. I was arguing in an prior episode, that running by feel was one of the harder ones because we've become so watch obsessed. So this is our attempt to get you a little bit less watch obsessed, if possible. Not to say that your GPS watch isn't a useful tool, but let's not forget the importance of listening to our body and using those senses and those cues as a perhaps even more important tool. Mm-hmm. So pausing there for a second, let's just start with reminding people of the case for running by feel and why that's important. What would you say?
The number one thing that comes to mind is not all days are created equal. So, yes, we use all kinds of tools, systems, science itself, our gadgets and gizmos like our watch to let us know where we're at. It's like charting the territory for us. But no day is created equal in that, the day after a hard quality, this is the most obvious, you probably don't feel your best. Neither should you feel your best, but it's not just quality workouts that come into play here. There's also everything else surrounding your life. The temperature of the day, again, another obvious one. When the environment changes, if I'm running uphill versus downhill, and imagine you're in an area of town that you don't know all that well, and you feel risers and you feel a descent, but it's only ever so slight, and you don't actually know what the grade is. And in a moment like that, you don't get an opportunity to use math to calculate it. So not every step is created equal. Not every day is created equal. Stress levels in your life, et cetera, et cetera. I was trying to stay super generic, actually, with examples to kind of anchor people. Yeah. But there's so many more that come into play. And so my hope is that it would suffice to say not all days are created equal. Therefore, you better pay attention to your own body.
I like that. It's also another way of saying not all paces are created equal in a sense, or really not all efforts are created equal. You know, I was just, as you were thinking about that and giving some of those examples, I was thinking about, okay, well, let's just talk about somebody running a 10-minute mile as an example. And if that person were running a 10-minute mile in 45-degree weather, that's one thing in terms of how that feels and what the effort might be associated with that. If they're running at that same 10-minute mile at 80 degrees and 40% humidity, that's a different level of effort, same pace. If they're running that same pace at 80 degrees but 95% humidity, which we face sometimes in our summers in the mornings, also a different level of effort. Now, we take that same person and we have them run a 10-minute mile at 5,000 feet of elevation, different effort. And then you take that person and take them to 8,000 feet, different effort. Mm-hmm. So all 10-minute miles right? But all very different effort levels. And the underlying thing about physiological development as a distance runner is that the thing that matters in terms of building the fundamentals of training and getting to your goal isn't 10-minute miles, it's cobbling together a puzzle, or pick your analogy, the recipe of all the different effort levels you need. And if you're just focused on pace and not thinking about all those other variables that might affect effort at a pace, then you're going to be in the wrong spot
Hmm.
and therefore not be able to achieve the purpose of the day, perhaps. And I think people lose sight of that perspective. You know, they might get a workout that says run 10-minute miles and not recognize that that context for what you're trying to achieve for that workout might vary depending on the conditions around you. And those are just external factors that I mentioned. There could also be, as you also alluded to, the factors that might affect you as a human. More stressful week, less sleep that week, didn't eat well that week for whatever reason, didn't feel well. Could be a lot of other variables that affect your effort that then therefore affect the outcomes you're trying to accomplish for that given workout. And so and so I'll pause there because you can take that and then you can also apply it to other things or other cues that people use. Some will use heart rate. Well, that's fine, but then you have to ask yourself, well, is my heart rate device calibrated appropriately? Is it accurate? Because oftentimes we rely on wrist-based heart rate, which we know isn't the most accurate form of measuring heart rate. Chest strap, sometimes people wear a chest strap, which is the more accurate way to measure heart rate. But then they'll also tell me, hey, my heart rate was 180 on an easy run. What's going on? Did something go off? I'm like, well, did it feel hard?
Hmm.
And they'll say no sometimes. And I'll say, well, maybe your chest strap is broken or not charged or somehow sometimes it gets off and syncs with cadence instead of heart rate. So again, all those external data metric variables that we're trying to use may or may not be telling us the right information to achieve the outcome that we're trying to achieve on the day. And so these are all reasons why effort is king. Effort matters more than anything else, but we can't easily measure it with a device on our wrist
Hmm.
necessarily. And we struggle with that.
Hmm. And it's like, not to go super purist on it, but it's the most transferable thing, no matter where you are, what's ahead of you, where you go. It's um, like if people believe that sort of intuitive layer and the ability to read their own body and their effort levels, if they commit themselves to understanding it. One, it doesn't take that long to learn. You will start to pick up on it. If like even when your coach gives you a workout like 8x800 at your 10K pace, and you're thinking, does this feel like something could sustain for 6.2 miles? You're just that little bit of a click moment where you're saying that to yourself. And then you start practicing that and trying to understand how you feel in a moment like that. You might be out on a run one time and you feel the pace picking up and the group's pressing and you're having fun, but at the same time, you're like, whew, I'm starting to think of that 800s workout. That I trust those signals. You know, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I am pushing towards my 10K effort now. So I think if people believe that they can learn it and they start paying attention to it, that's literally how you go about learning it. Then that is so transferable. If ever you're on a business trip and your watch died or you just forgot to pack it or whatever it may be, you live in Texas and traveled to Colorado and now you're running at altitude like the example you gave, you can transfer that sort of intuition and that feel, whether your devices are with you or not, or whether knew the calculations, or even if you knew the calculations, but you're at the trailhead and you don't even know you don't even know how to do the math on your own in that moment. It's so transferable.
Right. And to be clear, we're not here saying you shouldn't wear a watch or shouldn't look at your watch or watches are useless. You know, it's all what those are all of the data points you can collect to the extent that you put them in the appropriate box of the usability of the data that you're getting and not putting too much emphasis on it, then it's all useful.
Hmm.
Nobody's saying that a watch isn't helpful or important. We just want to make sure that we're developing all of the data, or not developing, but we're also reading all the data points that we're collecting, not just the ones from our wrists, but also the ones that we're perceiving from how we feel.
Hmm.
And that's, how is my breathing at a given effort level? How does my heart rate feel? You know, what's the tension like in my body? Is it hard? Is it easy? All of these different things that are subjective measures of how it feels. There's actually science that tells us that and using a term that is scientific in this context, rate of perceived exertion is something that we talk about in this chapter of the book, but it is a scientific term, basically 1 to 10 scale of how hard is this? How hard does it feel?
Hmm.
And science would tell us that people are actually pretty good at rating that relative to its equivalent pace or effort target zones if they let themselves.
Hmm.
And so we have a pretty good internal barometer for how hard things are. But most of the time, we're not listening to it, or we're not paying attention to it, or we're not noting it in addition to the other data that you're collecting. So it's not about no watch or ignoring your watch. It's more about just making sure you're being holistic about the data inputs you're collecting, not just the ones from the watch that you're getting on your screen, but also the ones that you're perceiving as you're out there moving through space. And so we just want you to open up to all of those variables and not become overly dependent on just the ones you're seeing on the screen.
Hmm. Yeah, because even in that example, like when you're using all of it, you can also work backwards. Like sometimes you might be actually hitting the paces, and everything's going well in a workout, but you're like, man, this feels like an 8 when typically 800. I'll stick with the same example. 800s at 10K feel like a 6 or so. And so, man, why is this a little bit harder? And then you think back and you're like, oh yeah, last 2 days I was stressed out at work and I skipped lunch yesterday and I only got 4.5 hours. Oh, starts you can almost work backwards in your plan when you've learned to marry the two together. So yes, it's not about anti-watch or anything, but just by like knowing effort levels and having spent a little bit of time paying attention to it, you can work backwards and forwards in workouts. And RPE, I like, like I don't coach like with my athletes. We've developed a language already, so I'm not reading off regular RPE like, all right, I want this one feeling like an 8, and that's not something we go through as an exercise. But I think just knowing that it exists, like, hey, there's a 1 to 10 scale, and getting the athletes on the front end to mark it down for themselves, I think it's an incredible tool for them to help develop their intuition and start marrying those two things together.
Yeah. And it's, again, just another data point or another way to think about it. Asking yourselves at a given pace that you might be familiar with this given set of conditions, how does it feel 1 to 10? If it feels like a 10 and you're supposed to be running half marathon pace
Mm-hmm.
or the equivalent, then you're probably doing something wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got to say, hey, well, there's a disconnect here between what I'm feeling and what my pace is indicating. And therefore, I need to adjust,
Mm-hmm.
because instead of basically blindly following what your watch is telling you and the indicated pace that you might be doing, you just want to corroborate that with the internal cues and say, all right, are these in alignment with the intended purpose for the day? If they are, great. If they're not, adjust.
Mm-hmm.
I always make this sort of comparison for people because we talk about this with races, for example, when it's going to be warm on race day. We've got the Austin Marathon coming up here this weekend, looking like it might be a little bit warm. Whenever it's going to be warm on race day, people always are resistant to adjusting their pace because of the warm weather. But ultimately, we encourage them to, because you can't fight physics and chemistry. And it's funny to me when you watch that in races or in training, when people are faced with warm or humid conditions, there's a resistance to adjust your pace or in order to match the effort that you need to in warm conditions and warm weather. And yet, if someone would go to altitude and they're 7,000 to 8,000 feet and they're sucking wind accordingly because the oxygen density is lower at higher altitudes, then we accept out of hand that it's okay to slow down in those conditions. And yet, when faced with similar, as a corollary, warm conditions, we don't allow ourselves to make those adjustments for whatever reason. And so this is really just about giving yourself permission to marry how you're feeling with the intended purpose of the day. And yes, using pace or heart rate as a corroborating data point and all of that, but not as the end all and be all.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious. This might take us a little off track for a second, but I'm curious. Why do you think people treat heat differently? Why do you think it is they won't make that adjustment? Even though, like, you're someone who will give it. You'll explain, hey, for every 5 degrees, I want you to make adjustments. And you're a person that a lot of people not only listen to your podcast, but have, like, you've coached so many and they ask you these questions. And then right up at that moment when it matters the most, it's still the guy they've trusted for like 20 weeks. And then, so why do you think it is? It's to me, it's got to be something there. If you know,
I don't know. It's a good question. I think part of it is physical in the sense that when you're at altitude, you have less oxygen. So it's a direct feeling.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you feel that direct lack of oxygen in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And with heat and humidity, it's not direct. You know, there's still the same amount of oxygen. It might feel like there's even more in a sense in like a humid environment because the air is thick.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more of an indirect effect where, you know, heat messes with chemical reactions, which messes with respiration. Heat also messes with or creates friction in our muscles so they can't move as freely. So it's disrupting the process of moving through space indirectly, and so you at the beginning of those types of runs, you have this sort of initial perception that, hey, I can actually still hit the paces. Like I can do this for at least a window of time before it starts to catch up with you,
Mm-hmm.
before you hit that friction. And so I think that's part of it. It's the direct versus indirect effect. I think the other part is just mental. You know, we don't want to let go
Mm-hmm.
of what we think. And so, you know, and some of it comes down with all of this comes down to ego. You know, we're always looking for validation that we can do the thing that we think we can do, especially in training. And we've talked about it before. If you're supposed to run 10K pace in a workout, but it's hot and humid, and so therefore you should really be adjusting to 20 to 30 seconds per mile slower in order to have the same effort. Mentally, people are going to come off of that workout if they did it appropriately and slow down accordingly, and they're going to think, well, I'm not good enough because I couldn't hit those paces. And so we're always looking for that validation. And when it doesn't come directly, then sometimes that leaves us wanting. And so then we're finding ways to get it directly anyway by just going too hard and forcing it, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a combination of an actual direct versus indirect effect, and then the mental side of people just being resistant to slowing down because of what that might mean about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And almost like, it's like none of this is comprehensive. It's like also like I'm adding, like I'm like, and I guess too, it makes sense that the closer you get to race day, the more you're in the mindset of like, I got to go for it.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like it's hard to be in both frames of mind at the same time. Like I'm willing to do anything to make this happen. And I need to be calculated and just do it by the math. Like I struggled with that as a golfer growing up all the time, the whole hit the smart shot versus grip it and rip it. And it was
right.
In both frames of mind, I was trying to do my best and be my best. Like one is, it's almost like when two values are split in you because you're like, I want to have the courage to know I faced the day and gave it my all and came after it and didn't hold back. And you want to be calculated and smart because you don't want to be the dumb form of courage where it's like, cool, great 15-mile run on your marathon race day.
It's like
Yeah.
the 10 cup example where he just keeps hitting it in the
Yeah.
water.
And we know the moral of the lesson in that one,
Right.
right? But in the human experience, it's still felt like it's still.
Yeah, and that's why I try to paint the picture of for people giving your all in a race looks like making those adjustments,
Mm.
being smart. That is a part of giving your all, especially in a half marathon or a marathon, these long distance races. You can't fight heat, you can't fight conditions. You have to make the smart adjustment. That is giving your all, being smart. And it's just looks a little different than the Americanized, David Goggins, grit and bear it kind of mentality, but it actually is a picture of giving your all and
Mhm.
doing it the smart way, controlling every variable you can control in order to ensure the best possible outcome. So we digress a little bit there, but I want to bring it back to this idea of what matters most here in getting training stimuli and training response is running certain efforts. We get training response by running certain efforts. We don't get training response by running certain paces. Now, in maybe the narrow category of race specific workouts, there is an application there that is very pace specific, but that's usually at the very tail end of a training block and has a relatively narrow application. But for the vast majority of every other category of work, we're trying to achieve an effort in order to get a certain result from our training. And pace and heart rate and RPE are all ways to kind of tell us, are we in the right effort zone in order to achieve the desired result? And it all comes down to using all of those inputs to make sure you're in the right zone in order to get what you want on a given day. Every day has its purpose, as you've alluded to earlier, and we've talked about in other podcasts. So that's the summary of it. Just keep in mind, effort is king in terms of getting the training outcomes you want. So then, to me, then the question becomes, okay, well, how do I live and breathe that? How do I actually make it happen? And so for this, I want to kind of talk about it in two ways. One, I want to talk about the details of what that looks like if you're actually in the middle of a run. And then separately, I want to talk about applying that to different effort levels. What are the kind of things you can look for, some cues to help people make sure they're in the right place when we're talking about easy runs versus recovery runs versus certain workouts? And so let's start with the first part of that, which is what does it look like to actually dial into effort? And this is where I kind of have an image of a martial artist, you know, or even a Star Wars image of use the Force
Mhm.
kind of idea, where Yoda's, helping young Skywalker figure out how to use the Force, and I think about when he has him put on the shield, the blast shield over his eyes, and he's got the droid that's flying around him shooting stuff at him, and he's using his lightsaber to block it.
Mhm.
And at first he tries without his eyes and he gets shot right away. And then finally he kind of stops and listens and really takes in information from all of his senses and then is able to block those things. So it's kind of like that. It's how you get to that Zen space, that use the force kind of space to really understand how you're feeling in each given moment. And so for that, for me, there's a little bit of just understanding what your cues are, breathing being one of them.
Mhm.
And what is your breathing like at a given effort zone or pace target or RPE? How do you feel your heart rate is or is not? Again, that's something that's a little bit weird to think about because it's not like it's beating in your ear necessarily, or at
Mhm.
least hopefully not. But you could kind of feel that, whether it's high or low, in control or out of control. There's also how your muscle tension and whether you're moving relaxed through space. I have this kind of cue routine that I'll go through in a run where I'm thinking about relaxing muscles from face to shoulders to arms and hands to legs, and really trying to think through how am I carrying tension in each of those spaces as I go through. And so that's something else that I will key into. The other thing for me is just, what does it feel like visually? That's kind of a maybe a more direct input, so to speak, but it's that feeling of how quickly or slowly are things flying by you, and how are you feeling that part of it. And so those are some of the things that I tap into. What are examples for you?
As on that, I'll piggyback on that last one and then add like some obvious ones that we've shared before. But sometimes like I know at least on the overtraining end, like if it's an equality, I'll literally see the color red. I know they talk about
Mm,
seeing red and as an expression for anger or whatever, but I can also, it's almost like the imagery in my head gets like a red type glow around it. Like I know I'm like, it's usually preceded by a little bit of I'm a little out of control. Um, which I know we talk about being in control, and and so sometimes it's okay. I would say, like, I don't want it to sound like a bad thing. Like, if you're like, "Whew, this workout's really getting me," we're getting to a fine line. But if I start to see that kind of halo of red in my head, that's when I know, all right, I'm like I
interesting.
even if someone's pulling away from me. But it's in addition to everything you said. It's not like
Right.
it's like
Sure.
that
Yeah, yeah.
alone,
But
but
it's
there's almost a
colors.
mounting.
It's interesting. I've heard John Mayer, the famous singer guitarist, who talks about he sees colors when he's
Mm,
playing the guitar, especially when he's doing improvisation with the guitar. He'll see like colors and shapes in
mm.
his mind's eye, essentially, in terms of how he's putting together the notes. So it kind of makes me think about that as an example, the running version.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but there's also science and history and literature with all of that as well. This is according to Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who is a leading authority on hemisphere theory. But our right brain brings uh, meaning, understands meaning, whereas left brain understands like logic, the logos, the knowledge of things. Like there's 800 meters at exactly my 10K pace. So that's all of our calculated side, which is a very small part of our brain actually, but it's that right brain that understands the meaning of things and is more closely connected to subconscious. And even Socrates himself had what he called a daemon. And he was like, it doesn't tell me what to do, but it definitely tells me what not to do. And he abided by that and became like the father of modern philosophy. So there's a lot here. It's what originally made me start trusting like the side of intuition, again, not as a counter to science, knowledge, and information, but as the appropriate companion to and even foundation and support to knowledge, information, science, calculated results, etc. There's a lot there, is all I'm saying,
Yeah.
and worth trusting, and why we, again, connected to why we push run by feel or understand that intuition is part of this game.
So those are all the parts of what you're feeling in the run. The other thing I would add to this equation is, how do you feel afterwards?
Mm,
Immediately afterwards, and then also later that day and the next day, because that is also a way to calibrate. If you feel, if, one example, for example, if you're doing a recovery run, and from my perspective, you want to feel better at the end of the run than in the start of the run,
hmm
because you've come off of something hard or long, and that recovery run is about the movement, which creates the blood flow, which helps promote healing. If you feel better at the end of the recovery run, then you probably got it right.
hmm
So that's an immediate way to think about it. If you feel better as the day progresses, then you can think back to how you felt in the run and say, all right, maybe I calibrated that right. Or if you feel worse at the end, then that's a cue that, hey, maybe I went a little too hard and I need to kind of recalibrate my effort during the run. Another thing with long runs, if you feel beat up the rest of the day and you can't do anything but lay on the couch and watch TV and feel like you don't have any energy for anything else, you probably went too hard. And so I think, or if you do a workout and you feel so beat up the next day that you don't even want to do your recovery run, then that's a sign you went a little too hard, perhaps. So these are all ways to think about it, is not just in the moment, but also what's the aftermath look like? And then how can you calibrate that back with how you felt on the run in order to adjust the next version of it? So that's another way to think about it. But then I think that gets us a good segue into this question of, okay, well, what are some cues depending on the type of runs? We've talked about this idea that every day has its purpose, and we've got, what is it, 3 or 4 different types of runs during the week. And so let's talk about how you should feel perhaps in each of those. Let's start with easy, medium, long run, and long runs. Assuming you're not doing any workouts inside of them, what should those feel like? What are some cues you give people?
One of the it's interesting, you had brought up heart rate earlier and talked about how it feels, and that's something I was going to go to as well in that example, but it applies here. It's like, is the heart rate, does it feel like it's in your chest as opposed to up in your throat? And also, it's okay if you notice it beating, but is it pounding? Like when you feel like it transfers to that pounding. But the classic and tried and true is, we talk about the talk test, but also the sing test for people that are alone. So if you and I can't quite talk like this without interrupting ourselves and saying, yeah, no, it's interesting that we were talking about, like, and I think people do that. I mean, I listen to people do that on runs, and I'm
Yeah.
not going to like get onto them in that moment, but it's
Right.
like, and I do it. I've done it myself. Right. And so it's like, but in that moment, I know, I'm like, there's my signal. Like, clearly we're not going easy enough, because I am having to interrupt myself and gasp for air. So, in the absence of having someone around you, you can try to sing a song. Um, and I do emphasize that one for when you're alone, because one, I don't want to sing in front of too many people. I guess I have at times. Um, but two, yeah, it's just a way to do it if you don't have anyone to talk to and you feel random just talking to the road. So,
I mean, it's the perfect example and the classic cue we always use for easy runs. You should be able to speak in full sentences comfortably. And if you
mhm,
can't, you're going too hard. And people might say, well, there's no way I can do that. Then you're going too hard.
mhm.
And if you need to be walking in order to speak comfortably in full sentences, then that's probably where you need to be starting in order to build into an easy run that will allow that. So, yes, speak in full sentences or sing comfortably your favorite song without you. And you were good at giving examples without that gasp for breath that you just heard on the audio, which I don't think I could recreate that. But
Well,
but
now I feel self-conscious.
no, it was perfect. You nailed it. You nailed it because you're right. It's if you need to pause to kind of take in your breath, then you're going too hard on your
Mhm,
easy, medium, long, or long days. Because again, in order to develop aerobic capacity in the right way, as well as to stay healthy and consistent with our running, we need it to be easy enough so we can do a lot of it. And therefore, you should be able to speak in full sentences, comfortably talk, or sing your favorite song without that break
mhm.
that you need to suck in the air. So that's easy runs. Now let's talk about recovery runs. Which I just gave that example of, a recovery run should feel better at the end than the start. I think that's one sort of post-mortem you can look at from a recovery run standpoint. If you're finishing those runs feeling better than when you began, or less sore, or feeling better energy wise, then you're doing it the right way, because those runs especially should be dependent on what your body has on the given day. And so we like to say, for recovery runs, you want to listen to your body. You want to go what we'll call glacially slow on those days, or pitter patter. Jog is another term we use. Basically, you want to feel like you're going uncomfortably slow
Mhm.
on your recovery run. So it might feel a little awkward at first. It might feel like it takes you a little bit to kind of get into that groove, but that's normal for a recovery run. And not only should you be able to speak in full sentences, but you should be able to orate a Shakespearean sonnet and maybe do a full monologue on a recovery run, because it is at an effort that is so painfully easy that you do feel better when you're done. And if you're not in that place, again, you're probably going too hard, because every day has its purpose. And the purpose of a recovery day is that easy movement to create blood flow to promote healing without taxing the body. Any
We
other things you like on recovery days?
I just wanted to add some fun since we were so technical last week, but I was like, we should see if we can't record a podcast while running our recovery run pace to put
There
proof
you
in the
go. We
pudding.
could show it. We'll have to figure
I'm
out
not
the
actually going to sign up for it, but
we'll
I
have
just
to
thought it
figure
was
out the
funny.
audio format on that. I know people have done running podcasts before. Carrie Tollefson used to do it. She used to do interviews that way periodically on her podcast, and then Tina Muir would do solo runs where she would give sort of audio commentary on her runs that so people could go on a run and run with her, so to speak. So it's been done before, but
Dang.
that would be a good example for people. But yeah, it should be so painfully easy. And, and that's where too, like thinking about the muscle tension part of the equation, muscle tension, you might have some soreness, residual soreness from a quality workout or from a long run, but you should feel that. I don't want to say dissipate, but you should feel it get better or more fluid as you progress through a recovery run. You should actually feel the body recovering in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
When I do these, I really like to ask myself, okay, what does my body need today
Mm-hmm.
in order to be recovered or to feel better at the end of the run? What does it need? And that question encompasses pace. What pace does it need today? Sometimes it also, for me, encompasses movement patterns or post-run work. So I've done recovery runs where I've stopped in the middle and done some basic mobility work just to get the limbs and muscles moving more fluidly before I continued. And those were all based on simply asking myself, what does my body need today in order to feel better at the end than the start? And then giving it exactly that, which, yeah, running's part of it, but could also be other elements.
Mm-hmm. What came to mind for me with all of that was on a recovery run, not only am I thinking of words like relaxed, but also gentle. Um, I'm super heady, so I always go to head stuff. So the heady folks out there maybe can appreciate this, but I try the way I work through it because my body will follow is very much like when I'm like like I'll start off by walking, and as I ease into the jog and sort of like shoulders go back, and I just slightly lean forward and allow like just falling forward to pull me. I try to ask myself, uh, what is that moment where you transition out of a walk and into a jog or an easy run? And then it's like playing a game of like, how can I hold that? Like where it's like almost so easy that backing off and walking wouldn't even it just slow me down, but it wouldn't even necessarily provide relief. It's sort of a mindset of like it's so gentle. And that's why that word pitter patter sounds so nice there, because your feet do just if you're approaching it gently and then you lean forward just slightly, you do end up in a little pitter patter uh, formation. And then the only other thing is usually, like, let's say it's an easy 3 mile run. So after like the second mile, like I typically will start feeling better. And on those days, I don't allow myself to tip further forward and find quote like a little nicer rhythm. I just stick to it. So for me, that signal is sort of like sweet. I'm starting to feel better, but instead of like going with it a little, I remain here so I feel even better when I'm done with that 3-4 mile recovery
Yep.
jaunt.
So those are some examples on the recovery side. Now let's dig into some of the quality effort levels, starting with one thing we talked about last week is sort of the thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
Aerobic threshold, a tempo effort in the middle, lactate threshold on the more advanced end of that range. And what are the feelings there? So for me, aerobic threshold, or that's an effort level that we also call steady or steady state. That's the point, that lactate one threshold where lactate starts to get produced at elevated levels into the bloodstream. So you're working, but at a lower threshold, not to repeat that word. And so what does that look like? What does aerobic threshold look like? We talked about it as an effort that you can hold for theoretically about 2 hours if you were doing a 2-hour race. And the way I like to describe it, or we like to describe it at Rogue, is it should be comfortably hard, meaning you recognize that you're working, but in such a way that it's a comfortable level of work. So the breathing is elevated at that point. You're not speaking in full sentences, but you can probably get out phrases and words here and there that would be understandable to your running partner. And so it's a little bit of that, James, How you feeling today? I'm good. You good? Like a just little bit of breaks, but you can actually have a broken conversation at that aerobic threshold level where it's comfortably hard and your goal really there is to find a rhythm that feels like, especially initially, something you can hold for a long, long period of time, almost
Mhm.
indefinitely in your mind. So you recognize it as work, but it's in such a smooth and relaxed form of work that it feels sustainable for at least in that moment forever.
Mhm. Yeah, and just asking myself, can I hold this? Could I hold this for 2 hours even if I don't want to today? Does this seem like,
Right.
yeah, if I had to, would I have this in me? Um, Within a pretty high degree of certainty. And that guides me through there.
And I like with any of these types of workouts, these threshold oriented workouts, I prefer people not use their watch really at all.
Mm.
To me, and we'll talk about some other examples towards the end of our discussion about, what are some practical ways to kind of work on these things. But, covering your watch or not looking at your watch to me is a tool that you can use in any of these examples to try to dial into perceived effort. And I think especially with threshold, aerobic threshold, lactate threshold work, it's even more important because the effort level part of it is so important. And it also requires you tapping into all of those cues. So you learn, I think, a lot faster how to get into these effort zones if you're willing to ignore your watch on these types of workouts. And so it's a way to speed up your learning curve if you're willing to kind of go there. And yes, have your watch on, collect the data, go back and look at it later so that you can corroborate how you felt with the paces that you might be seeing, considering all the external factors that might affect pace. But force yourself to just go it by feel
Mhm.
and be asking yourself, is this comfortably hard? And also, I think part of it too in all of this is being really present because there might be a moment where it shifts a little too much. You press the gas a little too much and you get to that place where it's more than comfortably hard. And I think there's a temptation for a lot of people to just roll with it. Well, I'm already here. I'll just keep going at that pace versus recognizing it as quickly as you can, calling that or calling out that moment to yourself and saying, all right, I'm going to pull back,
Mhm.
regain that comfortably hard space, and then find that rhythm again. And so you got to give yourself permission to also just learn in real time.
Mhm.
So that's aerobic threshold. Then we get to what we call tempo, or kind of that middle zone between aerobic threshold and lactate threshold. That's where you're producing lactate, but in a way that's more equilibrium and you can efficiently process it and reuse it as fuel or discard it as waste. And in that space, you recognize that you're working, but you're still very much in control of the work. So it kind of goes from comfortably hard to no longer comfortable, so to speak, but you're still very much in control of what's happening to you. Because if you start to spiral out of control or get too close to the edge, then you're into that lactate threshold space or beyond. You, I think, like to call this fidgety pace
Mhm. I was just thinking
or
on that.
fidgety effort. So explain what that means.
I like the word fidgety because I hope people can connect to it, but it's definitely captures what I feel. Like I want to fidget. Like I want to get out of a it's sort of like a feeling you get on a plane, like when you're like stuck in the middle seat. You're fine. You have your own seat. It's designated. You're going to the place you want to go, but also you're just like, man, I'd like for the you're looking for your bailout options. And so again, the word control is very important because if you're on the verge of quite literally bailing out, you're probably tipping too far. But it's I know when I get my mind into that space of like I get fidgety. It's like when a room I think is exactly I don't know the exact temps. I would have to watch temps, but there's always that balmy feeling in it. Like there's a feeling in a room where the temperature is almost too even kill sometimes, and you're just like you keep wanting to go check the thermostat. You're like, I don't know if I should bump it up to make it colder or not. But it's like that feeling on the plane, that feeling when the room's kind of stale, or that feeling where you're like starting to just think about your bailout options. So in my head, I call it fidgety because I'm not necessarily I am being controlled with the action. I'm choosing to do the workout, and I'm aware of the fact that I'm capable. My legs are fine. I'm not like out of like way out there and anxious, but it's just starting to feel again, that's that boiling feeling. That means we're getting close to that lactate threshold. So that's my language around a felt experience. And I hope it doesn't muddy the water. I hope it makes it more
Yeah, I mean, you're fidgety. You're like, oh, there's a temptation to go faster because that's what we're taught. Go harder. That harder is better. But then there's also this internal resistance that says, oh, that's hard. I don't want to go faster. So you don't want to slow down either. And so you get in that middle sweet spot that is in control, but fidgety in both directions.
mm-hmm.
So I always use that example when I talk to people about it, but stole it from you, James. So that's tempo, lactate threshold, or anaerobic threshold, that point where you get to the edge of your body being able to control your lactate production. And that's when we're in control still, but barely in control, kind of right on the edge of control. And when you go over the edge, because then heart rate starts to spiral, breathing starts to spiral. You're like, oh, suddenly you get on this downward spiral of if I keep going at this pace, then I'm going to lose it altogether, or I'm going to have to pull over and stop. And so you're right on the edge of that point, still being able to continue without that kind of countdown clock coming
Mm-hmm.
for you when it's almost over. And so you want to be right on the edge of control, but just there and not rolling over. And I think lactate threshold to me is one of the harder ones to find because it is so close to that edge and we're always tempted to go beyond it just because that's, when you get to that space, it's almost easier to press into the void than it is to stay
Mm-hmm.
just short of the void
Mm-hmm.
in my mind. And so I think that's when you're kind of on this precipice and it's so easy to just fall over versus stay right where you need to be. And so I think this is maybe the hardest effort to find lactate threshold because it is so close. And I also think it's where the presence of mind is so important of not going over the edge. And if you do get a little bit beyond the edge, pulling back so that you still have that semblance of control.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where you're working. You're not talking here, probably. If you are, it's a word, here or there. But you're right on the edge of being in that anaerobic space.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, this is not the only reason. Back to things not being comprehensive, but additive. That is one reason why with ATLT workouts I like them time based because like you were using that language of like it's easier to just lean into it and I think this can still happen. Some people can still do that and bomb it and it sort of blows up the workout. But at the very least, when I remove it from being mileage based, and they can be mileage based, I'm not saying anything against them, but I started including time based because it eliminates that reward. That if that temptation comes where they're like, shoot, okay, mile to go, I can do anything for a mile. Sometimes they're just tired of sitting in that like fidgety window that you're like, F it. And they just go for the last mile and they just burn off because it's like, I'd rather just be done.
Right.
And so they'll speed up and go. And but if it's time based, you don't get
There's
the
no
reward.
incentive. Yeah,
You're like, I'm at the 32nd minute of 40 minutes of sitting in this window.
Going
So if I
faster doesn't
speed up,
help
I
you.
still have 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. That's a little coach's trick.
I mean,
behind the scenes for you.
Yeah.
And also remember the lactate threshold, that's still the effort you can theoretically hold for an hour.
Mhm.
So that's still a long time. It's still aerobic, meaning, you haven't pushed into those secondary processes to create energy beyond respiration. And so it's still aerobic. So you're still something you can hold for an hour, but you're just on the edge of that control. From there, obviously, we get into the anaerobic spaces, where VO2 max lives, 5K, 10K paces, 3K paces. And then obviously you can go even beyond that to even more anaerobic spaces. And as we get into those zones, to me, that's when it's less about describing things and more about matching breathing rate with how you feel with your leg turnover, with how you're feeling with your heart rate, and just being able to dial into those given effort zones based on those variables
Mhm.
and kind of playing with them over time. Because obviously, at a 5K pace, you can hold for 3 miles, but if you're doing an 800-meter rep at 5K pace, then you're working pretty good
Mhm.
there. And so then your breathing's elevated, your heart rate's elevated, you're not talking, and you're kind of learning the leg turnover that matches those breathing rates and heart rates, and then calibrating all of that over time so you can get really refined with your pacing. But at that point, to me, it's less about kind of cues and descriptors and more about you learning how your body feels with each of those faster kind of zones.
Mhm. And those often come with like bigger recoveries too. So you're not in your they're shorter distances with bigger recoveries, and so you're not in your head as long. Like there's a lot more language you can put on threshold and steady state and easy runs, because that's like you're going to be in that thought for quite a while. Where
Which does, though, I think mentioning the recoveries to me is a useful cue. It's sort of the post interval cue. You know, if you have 8 times 800 at 5K pace with 2 minutes recovery, and you get through the first rep and you're feeling already beat up or on the limit, then you've gone too fast.
Mhm.
So it kind of becomes this rep by rep check in, recovery segment by recovery segment check in of, can I do the workout? Am I running at a pace or effort that allows me to complete the given workout?
Mhm.
Or do I already feel like I'm on the limit? Do I have more reps in my legs? And so being able to respond in the moment to those types of questions becomes important. Because if you're 2 reps in and you're already feeling like you're on the limit of doing these 5K reps, you're probably not running 5K pace. You're probably going too fast, or your efforts not calibrated appropriately. And you want to be able to then get to the end and feel like, all right, got through 8 reps. Feel like I could do one more perhaps, because we
Mhm.
always want to leave typically one rep on the table. But that was right. Maintained the pace, recoveries were appropriate, got through all the reps, felt like I could do one more rep. Then you being able to look back on that workout and say, all right, given that I was able to do it successfully, how did that feel along the way?
Mhm.
And kind of internalize those cues, carry that forward to the next version of that workout or the next time you do that effort level. Versus if you go too hard, too fast, you kind of crash out in the middle and feel like you can't do it or your form falls apart, then that's a cue that, hey, I was going too hard. And therefore, the cues that were associated with that should have warned me.
Mhm.
So, therefore, next time, can I heed those warning signals and therefore slow down in the moment so that I can actually finish the workout? So, I do think, kind of thinking on the post mortem, and when you get to some of those faster, shorter interval workouts, it's really about how does managing in the moment feel?
Mhm.
Can you complete it as written? Because one of the things we talk about as coaches is we want you to be able to complete the workout, maybe with a slight progression, leave one rep on the table, and have the paces be relatively consistent or maybe slightly faster as you go through it. But if you slow down dramatically at the end, then that's probably a sign to stop.
Mhm.
And then you got to ask yourself, well, what did I learn from that I can take forward to the next one to not have that happen? And that's just where the accumulation of at bats in these types of situations helps you focus on these things. But it all comes not because you're married to looking at your watch, but you're rather asking yourself, how did that feel?
Mhm.
So that you can put the two things together. So those are some examples as we're kind of talking through the types of workouts. Now I want to get quickly to some of the practical ways that we can force ourselves to learn these things. We've already talked about one, which is covering your watch or not looking at your watch. I think that's a cue that people don't use enough.
Mhm.
And that can apply to me in all sorts of workouts or runs. I rarely look at my watch on an easy run or recovery run. I'm just listening to my body, listening to, can I talk? Is the effort appropriate? In workouts, sometimes I'll do workouts without looking at my watch in the moment, and then I'll look at it later. I've done races that way. I was just on the Inspired Souls podcast this past week. You can pick that up on my Instagram if you want to check it out. with Carolyn Coffin, and she's talking about doing Boston without a watch,
Mm.
or with a watch, but covering the watch so she can do the whole thing by feel, which I think is a really cool pursuit because she's really trying to level up her ability to feel, not just in workouts, but in races. So maybe on occasion do a race that way and
Mm-hmm.
see what happens and see what you can learn from that experience. So that's one example. We've talked about that at length. So I want to talk about one or two others at least. Another one that I like, and I'll let you maybe contribute one for the list is, and this is what I learned from John Trupp, is the idea of treating everything as a slight progression. Because as you progress through efforts or paces, you have to kind of pay attention at each little subtle incremental shift as you get through it. And then not only does it allow you to really key in or key into what it feels like across those paces or efforts, but also prevents you from overshooting. Because we have this thing where people often they go way too fast on the first rep when they're trying to calibrate, and then they pull way back, and maybe they pull back too much, and then they're kind of off for the first three until they finally dial in. Well, if you're always slightly slow on the first rep and then incrementally faster and kind of work down towards that target, then it teaches you not only how to feel that out, but then also means you don't overshoot it and
Mm-hmm.
kind of screw up the first couple of reps. So he taught me when he was my coach that everything should happen in progression. Just sometimes more dramatic, sometimes more subtle, but that way you're kind of feeling out every single step towards a given pace or effort zone, and then also you're less likely to overshoot it as a result.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way I like to learn to dial into efforts. Any other that you would give us?
Well, real quick on that one, and you're saying not just like, let's say someone was doing 10 by 400, you're not just saying that the 10th is faster than the first, but you're also saying within the 400 itself, correct?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Sorry, I was filing that away because I
Yeah,
was like processing with you, and I
everything in
was,
progression. And then you race in progression, right? So it
Mhm.
also teaches you how to execute a progression in a race. And depending on where you are in the cycle, it might be more dramatic or less dramatic. Like if you're early in the cycle, your progression towards your target for the workout might be more dramatic. When you
Mhm.
get later in the cycle, it's going to be more subtle. Where if you're trying to hit a 5K pace for an 800, you might only be 1 or 2 seconds slow in the first rep,
Mhm.
right on pace for the second rep, and then holding pace. And then maybe the last rep, you're slightly faster, but you're going to be more dialed across all the reps the closer you get to your race day. And so it could be very subtle and it could be more dramatic just depending on where you are. But that was always a way for me to learn how to feel every little effort along the way. And then also to make sure I didn't overshoot. I think it's also productive on easy runs or recovery runs if you're starting out glacially slow and progressing into a recovery run, then your body naturally warms up. You're not necessarily going to go fast, but you're going to go a little faster than you started as your body warms into the workout. So it's you progress there, you progress in workouts, you progress in races. It should kind of always be present. And if you're living that way, not only are you learning to run by feel better, but I think you're also probably more likely to hit your targets than not.
Mhm. And someone doing that, their learning curve is going to shoot through the roof. Like what they'll have to employ patience on the front end for like the first month or two, but it's like they'll literally shoot past people who don't invest the time.
Yeah. So, anything else there before we wrap this one?
I don't feel like strongly compelled to throw anything else on it.
Okay. Well, I will end this one with a challenge to the audience to play with in some form something we talked about today. Just pick one thing that resonated with you or that maybe was flagged in your head as, "Oh, I really screwed that up." They're talking to me on that one. Just pick one thing that you can go apply in your running in this next week and just see what happens. Just see what
Mhm.
happens because all of this stuff, right now is living perhaps in the theoretical. It's in a book, it's in a podcast, but how do we make it real and practical? And some of you might be looking at us, rolling your eyes, being like, how important is that? I really love my Garmin. But maybe just maybe we're onto something. So I would challenge you to pick one thing from what we've talked about today and try to apply it in a way that makes you a little more tuned into the force as Yoda would teach you and will be your Yodas in this space.
And now I guess I do have one thing to tack for those that are truly lost and don't even know it. Because I feel like that's good because, you know, our more advanced athletes may want to take a nuance, but like someone that's not currently writing down on a 1 to 10 scale how any run felt, I would just encourage to start with that because it's low hanging fruit. If you're on Strava, you can just use it in the notes section. You can just like recovery run, just like write a number, like just start mindlessly logging a 1 to 10 scale on how you think it felt on a effort level.
I like it.
And
Just start.
over time, the pattern almost like even if I'm thinking even if their brains are like, but I don't know the science, and I'm just barely keeping up with the podcast, and I'm kind of putting my nose into this and learning it. Don't even know what any of it means. Just record it. Just write it down and let the pattern reveal itself to you.
I like it. Just start with observation if you don't know where else to start.
It's crazy how helpful that is.
All right. Well, we will wrap it. A couple of reminders as we're wrapping. One, we're in chapter 6 going through the book on the podcast. If you want to get it, you can check it out in our Instagram bios at Rogue Running or at Rogue Chris. You can check out our website, roguerunning.com, where if you'd like to learn how to train with us, either in person in Dallas or Austin or virtually in any of our virtual groups or virtual one-on-one, you can find all that information on our website, roguerunning.com. Also, I want to invite you, if you haven't already, to check us out on Friday on our Instagram at Rogue Running. We go live every Friday at 2 p.m. Central to ask questions or to answer questions, ask and answer questions. So if you have a question about your own training and you want to take it to us, then get on the Instagram live at 2 p.m. on a Friday. If you can't make that, you can also throw your questions in YouTube comments if you check us out on YouTube. So there's lots of ways to interact with us if you're wanting more. But yeah, I think that's it. All right. We'll wrap this one here. As always, check us out at Rogue Running and on our website at roguerunning.com. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon.